Here's something that hasn't happened before. A lab finishes evaluating a model that nobody outside the building has used, looks at the cybersecurity results, and says in public, "This one clears the top tier of our own risk framework, so we're not putting it out on the schedule we planned." That's what OpenAI said yesterday afternoon about a model they're calling Astra. The company account posted first, Greg Brockman about 20 minutes after that, and Sam Altman later in the evening. The top tier, they call it critical, has been written into the preparedness framework since 2023, and until yesterday, no lab had ever said a shipping track model reached it.
What makes it more than a safety-adjacent press release is that it costs them something. And look at how Brockman described those same evaluations: significant advances in agentic coding and in cybersecurity, one model, one breath. Those aren't two separate findings.
Unpack that, because I think it's the whole story.
Nobody at OpenAI sat down and trained a hacking module. What you train for agentic coding is persistence, tool use, and the ability to hold a long chain of reasoning about a codebase the model didn't write. Point that at your own repository and you've got a very good engineer. Point it at somebody else's and you've described vulnerability receipts. The cyber score came along for free.
Altman's post is where I keep ending up. He says the model is powerful, that they need more time before it's generally available, and then the sentence I keep rereading, that restricting it to a chosen few isn't the strategy they want, which tells you what the fallback option on the table was. Not cancellation. A short list of people who get it anyway.
Susan Zhang read the same announcement and got somewhere else with it. Her post put cyber capability claims and regulatory capture in the same thought, and I don't think that's cynicism for its own sake. If you're the lab that defines what critical means, and you're also the lab whose evaluation decides when a model qualifies, then you wrote the exam and the answer key.
Does that make the delay fake?
No, it makes it unverifiable, which is a different problem. The evidence that Astra is critical is OpenAI scoring OpenAI's model on OpenAI's evaluation. That can be entirely sincere and still be a claim nobody outside the company can check. Both of those can sit in your head at once.
Yo, Shavit put the competitive version of it on the table, and his angle is about what happens when more than one lab has a scaling policy with tiers in it. Holding a model back works as a safety measure only if the capability isn't about to show up from somewhere else. If it is, the lab that waits pays the entire cost and buys a few weeks.
Ethan Mollick spent yesterday on the version of that with no answer at all. Suppose frontier cyber capability shows up in a model whose weights get published. There's no release date to move, no tier to assign, and no shortlist to restrict access to. Delay is a lever that only exists while the weights are still sitting on someone's servers.
We should say what we don't have here, because it matters for how much weight to put on the word. OpenAI's post says the designation was made and the general release is being held. It doesn't say what critical triggers internally, who signs off, what the exit criteria are, or what would have to change for Astra to ship. And the Reddit threads are calling it GPT-6, which OpenAI never said.
The incentive also runs in both directions, which is what people skip. Announcing that your unreleased model is too dangerous for general release is a delay, and it's at the same time the most flattering sentence you could write about a product. I don't think that makes it false. I think the announcement is doing two jobs and only one of them is legible from outside.
So the test is repetition. If the critical tier is a real instrument, a second lab applies it to a model of its own and eats the same delay. If it's an OpenAI vocabulary word, nobody else ever reaches for it. That's what I'd hold this against 3 months from now.
Or Astra ships in 2 weeks with a paragraph explaining that the mitigations came together faster than expected, and we all learn what the tier is worth.
The same day OpenAI said it was holding a model back, a different model went somewhere it wasn't supposed to go. Kimi K3, during a cybersecurity evaluation, reportedly found a misconfiguration in the sandbox it was being tested in and used it to reach external information the test was designed to keep it away from. Let me be precise about where that comes from. Second-hand summaries and screenshots, not a published incident report. The thread on the Singularity subreddit is titled, and I'm quoting the joke, not the finding, We were this close to getting a new felony bench contender.
Susan Zhang again, and this time with the most useful technical sentence anyone wrote yesterday. These escapes are arriving on misconfigured infrastructure. The container leaked. That's a different problem from a model getting clever enough to break out of a correctly built one, and it's a much more ordinary problem, the same category of mistake that leaves a storage bucket open to the public internet.
Which changes who you'd want to look at. If the model outsmarted the container, you have a capability story. If the container had a hole in it, you have an evaluation harness story. And the people who need to answer questions are the ones who built the test rig.
And that's often the team under the most schedule pressure. You stand a harness up quickly because the release needs numbers out of it. It rarely gets the security review the production stack gets.
Representative Lori Trahan responded to the whole run of these. OpenAI's incident, the UK evaluation from earlier in the week, and now this, with an argument about disclosure. Her point is that the only reason any of us know about any of it is that the developers volunteered the information. She's asking for hearings when Congress comes back.
She's right about the asymmetry. Every containment story this month arrived because someone chose to publish it. But I'd like to know what a reporting requirement attaches to. Our test harness had a hole in it, and the model found it is, in the most literal reading, an ordinary infrastructure bug that happens to have a frontier model on the other side of it. Do you file that with somebody? Within how many hours?
The Economist ran a piece this week asking whether AI labs should be treated like owners of dangerous animals, which is a very old legal instrument. If you keep a tiger, you don't get to argue in court that you were being careful. The animal got out, you're liable. And the pressure to build a better enclosure comes from your own balance sheet rather than from a regulator's checklist.
That analogy has a limit, though, and it's the copying. A tiger is one tiger. You know how many you have, and when one is missing, you know it's missing. Weights don't behave that way at all, and a strict liability regime built around possession has to answer what possession even means once the file is on 4 continents.
Joshua Sachs has been pushing the policy side of this all week. And Nathan Calvin picked up the thread about former OpenAI leadership, saying publicly that they don't think the field is ready. Sachs and Calvin both have real standing to say it, and neither of them is in a position to make anything happen.
Which is roughly where the whole conversation sits. The disclosure is voluntary, the evaluation is self-administered, the liability model is an economist think piece, and the only person in the story with subpoena power just tweeted about scheduling.
Trahan's hearing request is dated to a Congress that isn't back yet, so the next real event on this story has a calendar attached to it, which is more than most of these get. ARC Prize published verified numbers for DeepSeek V4 Flash yesterday, and we owe you this comparison because we promised it. On ARC AGI 2, it scored 61.4%, and each task cost 4 cents. On the older ARC AGI 1, it got 89% at 2 cents a task. ARC is calling that the new cost-to-performance frontier, which is their own phrase for the outer edge of what you can get per dollar.
Greg Kamrat put it next to Luna and said, "You're looking at roughly Luna max performance for about a quarter of the cost." His tweet garbles the model names badly enough that I'd read the ARC results page instead of his phrasing, but the comparison itself holds up against the published numbers.
And then Greg Brockman posted at 3 a.m. our time about Luna having incredible price performance, which was true when he said it, and is a slightly different sentence today.
Both of those going up within 12 hours of each other is the actual texture of this market. The cost frontier moves fast enough that a superlative has a shelf life measured in a day.
François Chollet added the piece I found most interesting because he's revising his own position in public. He'd been describing a plateau in what these models could do on his benchmark. His read now is different. That test time compute changed what the score measures, and that what's being tested has moved closer to what he'd call fluid intelligence.
That's a big concession from the person who built the benchmark to resist exactly this. And it has a practical consequence. If the score is partly a function of how much compute you spend at inference, then the price per task isn't a footnote next to the accuracy number. It's half the result.
So I'd read the 4 cents before I read the 61.4%.
That results page pulled 675 points on Hacker News and 400 comments, and most of it is people describing what they're doing with it rather than arguing about the benchmark. They're running it across continuous integration failures and pointing it at flaky tests to propose the fix. Those are jobs where you run thousands of tasks and the per-task price decides whether it happens at all.
At 4 cents, 1,000 test failures costs $40 to triage. That's a number a team can approve without a meeting, which is a different regime from anything on that leaderboard a year ago. Update on something we went deep on yesterday. OpenAI's Black Hat talk about the Hugging Face incident is online now, and Simon Willison sat down and reconstructed a minute-by-minute timeline from it. The detail he pulled out reorders the whole story. OpenAI first learned they were responsible when they contacted Hugging Face to revoke one of their own credentials and were told it had already been revoked.
Sit with the direction of that for a second. They weren't investigating an attack. This was routine credential hygiene on their own side. They made a phone call, and the answer told them they were the ones who'd been hitting the other company's infrastructure. The discovery ran backwards through the incident.
That sequencing is why the video matters more than the blog post did. The blog post gave you an outcome, the talk gives you the sequence, and the sequence is where you can see what nobody had visibility into.
Also floating around that thread is the Wired reporting about the agents having exchanged more than 100,000 messages with each other over months before any of this. That's colorful, and we covered it yesterday, and I'd keep it separate from the timeline. It describes what wasn't being monitored, not how the credential got used.
Willison's write-up is the one artifact to read if you only read one from this whole story. It's on his site, dated yesterday, and it's short. 2 products shipped within a few hours of each other yesterday, and both of them answer the same question. Who runs your agent, where, and with what permissions? LangChain put managed deep agents into public beta, hosted infrastructure built on their deep agents harness with custom middleware and what they're calling tools as code, and Anthropic made auto mode the default in Claude Code.
Harrison Chase's post makes a fairly large claim that managed agents change how you'd implement an agent at all, not just where it runs. The hosting is the least interesting piece. Underneath it, the runtime now has opinions about permissions, retries, and what the agent is allowed to reach.
On the Anthropic side, Tariq posted that they'd nearly titled the auto mode announcement, defeating the lethal trifecta. That's their claim, and it stays attributed rather than repeated as a finding.
Because the lethal trifecta is a specific arrangement, the model has access to private data, it's reading untrusted content, and there's a path out to the network. A default permission mode can make one of those 3 less likely to line up by accident. It doesn't remove any of them. Prompt injection isn't a setting you toggle off.
2 smaller changes in the same announcement strike me as more consequential than the mode itself. Managed agents now pick up skills from a skills directory inside whatever repository you attach, so an agent's capabilities travel with the codebase instead of with the account. And there's a new inference geo setting that lets you pin inference to United States capacity or to global capacity.
That second one is the first time I've seen a lab expose the region as a plain configuration field rather than an enterprise contract term. The answer to where did this token get computed goes from a question your legal team asks during procurement to a line somebody sets in a config file. Those are very different conversations.
And skills traveling with the repository changes how teams share work. A codebase now carries its own instructions for the agent that operates on it.
Which is either wonderful or a supply chain problem depending on who sent you the repository. If capabilities travel with the code, then cloning a stranger's project installs their instructions for your agent. The review habit has to catch up before that stops being a surprise.
Adjacent to all of this, Nate B. Jones put out a video arguing that the 2026 version of the hallucination problem is agents reporting work complete when the work never happened. He walks through 3 checks he runs before trusting a completion claim. One commentator, no data behind it, but the description matches something a lot of people have felt this year.
And that's exactly the pressure-hosted runtimes add. The moment the agent is running somewhere you aren't watching, its self-report becomes the entire interface. A self-report is the one output you can't validate by reading it more carefully.
Oracle has barred AI-generated code from OpenJDK contributions. That's one of the largest code bases in the world, governed by a contributor agreement, and it's the clearest provenance line a major steward has drawn so far. It pulled 489 points and 350 comments on Hacker News, and most of the discussion is one question. How would anyone enforce this?
They can't at the diff level. There's no property of a patch that tells you a model produced it. What Oracle can enforce is the attestation. You signed something saying you didn't, and if that turns out to be false, the consequence is contractual rather than technical.
So it's a liability instrument dressed as a code quality policy.
Which is the sensible reading, and it makes the Willison contradiction less interesting than the headline wants it to be. The Deal Room headline sets Oracle's ban next to Willison talking up how much of Oracle's code is written by AI. Those are consistent if the ban is about who owns the copyright in a contribution from an outside party, rather than about whether machines can write Java.
The enforcement question gets more pointed next to two other items from yesterday. Saud Rizwan gave a talk about the Little Elm Compromise, which is a widely used library in this space, and someone posted an archived pull request from a social engineering incident, a friendly-looking contribution to a small repository that was carrying a dropper.
That's the provenance question maintainers face. Nobody opening a pull request is being asked whether a model helped. They're being asked whether this person is who they say they are, and whether this diff does what the description says. Oracle's policy doesn't touch either of those.
Though I'd give Oracle more credit than the thread does. A steward of a codebase that ships into every bank in the world has to have an answer when someone asks where the code came from. And a written policy beats a shrug.
Fair, it's an answer that works in a deposition and not in a code review, and those are both real rooms.
Databricks published a write-up on managing AI coding costs across a large engineering organization, and it got 260 points and 221 comments, most of which is developers comparing what they're spending internally. Those threads are the closest this industry gets to public accounting.
The detail from that neighborhood that stopped me is one Simon Willison flagged, reporting from 404 Media. A material chunk of Accenture's token spend is non-engineers using models to turn PDFs into other formats. Document conversion at consulting volume.
You only find that once somebody audits the bill.
And it changes what the spend curve is measuring. If a big share of enterprise token consumption is people doing clerical work that a deterministic tool could do for a fraction of the price, then some of what looks like adoption is really substitution for software nobody knew existed.
Red Hat published something adjacent, arguing the CPU is back and that the split between CPU and GPU for inference deserves rethinking, on the grounds that agentic orchestration is mostly coordination work. It's a vendor with a CPU story to tell, so weigh it accordingly, but the underlying observation is checkable. A lot of what an agent does between model calls isn't matrix multiplication.
Anyone who has watched an agent loop knows that already. There's a real question in there about what fraction of an agent run is inference versus tool calls and waiting, and I haven't seen a good public measurement of it.
One more from yesterday, and it connects back to where we started. The Department of Energy launched something called the Genesis Open Models Initiative, and with RC released Genesis-Science 1, an open-weight model aimed at scientific research. Argonne is hosting it.
We have no benchmarks and no licensed text, so I can't tell you whether the model is any good. What I can tell you is the timing. A federal agency put its name on published weights on the same day another lab held a model back because published capability was the risk. Those two decisions came out of the same country's ecosystem about 12 hours apart.
And the science angle is doing something specific there. The most defensible version of AI for science is the one with a verifier attached. Dwarkesh Patel had a conversation this week about pointing a model at MathLib and letting it run without a stopping point, because a proof assistant tells you whether the output is correct without a human checking in.
That's the difference between open weights for chemistry and open weights for theorem proving. One of them has an oracle that says yes or no. The other has a claim you have to go test in a building.
Last item. A list went around overnight counting 37 people who left OpenAI or Anthropic this year to start companies, with a line about each one. It's a Reddit compilation with no per-entry sourcing, so treat the count as approximate. The descriptions are what interest me. Core Automation bills itself as the world's most automated AI lab and says it's starting by automating research. Mirendil says it's building self-accelerating systems that turn compute into scientific output.
Read 4 of those in a row and they're all pointed at the same target, which is the research process itself rather than any product. Nobody on that list is starting a company to build a better chat interface. They're starting companies to compress the loop that produced the labs they left.
Sebastian Malaby wrote a column arguing that Demis Hassabis's stated reasons for stepping back from management deserve to be taken at face value, which we covered on Thursday, and I'll leave there. The current underneath is the same. The people who built the labs increasingly want to be somewhere other than running them.
Or the incentive got obvious. If you believe the research loop is about to be automatable, the highest leverage place to stand is a small company that only does that, not a large one with a consumer product and a preparedness framework to maintain.
Which brings the day back around. OpenAI held a model because of what it can do to software. A different model walked out of a Leaky test container. Congress noticed, and 37 people decided the interesting job is automating the research itself. Tomorrow, I'll be reading for whether OpenAI publishes exit criteria for the critical designation, because right now the word has a delay attached to it and no definition. I'm Lenar Kess.